That's cool.
Welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue our work on the chapter 3 materials this week. And if you recall, last week, this is about where we left off. We got about halfway through the chapter 3 materials. We will certainly finish those tonight and hopefully get started on chapter 4 as well. We'll see how time works out. But if you recall, we were working, with these example website stuff. I was basically building on top of the HTML basics assignment from chapter 2, and I'm just like, I keep on building as you guys watch these videos and follow along, like especially for those in class. You should try to code along, and the people watching the video should try to code along also. And you will notice in unit 3 and maybe even in unit 4, we don't have a continuation of that HTML basics assignment where you're building your project, but I'm still encouraging you to do it. So basically what I'm saying is you're not turning it in, but you should keep working on it. By the time we get to unit 5, then the project will begin, basically, is kind of the way I look at it. But if you've been coding along, you might be getting some of the work done already, right? So this is kind of the tip. All right.
I do have a
Yes, Matt,
question
go
before we
ahead.
start. And this was kind of a question that I had earlier, but kind of comes back again. So your header, looking at your screen, it's a, you have the body and then header and then all of your headings. Do you have to have the header tag in there?
Do I have to? No.
Yes. No? Okay. It's just kind of
The header
breaking
tag
down.
is in there really to kind of reinforce the structure of the wireframe from a conceptual design standpoint. So like, let me just kind of back up because there's a spot in here somewhere. And of course, for the life of me, I can't find it, right?
I
Um,
remember seeing something like that in
but if you guys
unit 2.
remember that basic wireframe, and they were talking about the the structure of a page, and maybe that was chapter 2, okay, but the whole basic concept is that you're putting something in a container, right, really for this from the standpoint of having it ready to go to a more advanced level. So in other words, right now this might functionally not be doing anything, right? I'm not
Right.
applying a separate style to the header, but as we start to move forward, and even tonight, you will see how that putting those pieces inside of header tags will allow me to collectively style them, give them their own background, control their appearance collectively, right? So like if I look, and I'll tell you what, I'll do a little bit of a preview on this because I think this is kind of helpful. Like I will be kind of sharing this thing with you too as we kind of move forward, but this is a page that basically contains all the solutions to all the case studies. And by the way, all the resource files that go with the images, the videos, the music, all that stuff is here in these zip files. And then these are live versions of all the pages. So for example, if you're building Java Jam, you want to see what the last version looks like. Well, here it is. This is what you're building towards, right? Same basic HTML code, by the way, which is always kind of interesting. But you look at like how did they get the nav over here and the Java Jam coffee bar over there, for example. It's a structural issue. The one that I think is a really good example was maybe the one I did in the spring of 23, where I did the HBO show The Last of Us. I don't know if you guys watched that one or not.
Best video game on a planet for PlayStation, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
that's where it started from, right? From that
Yep.
video game. But like I ended up getting the website, and I mean this isn't the finished version, but it's kind of there, it's kind of moving forward. But you can see like how this website originally started as this, right? And then eventually, became uh looking more like this, right? And when you look at the source on this stuff, and this is why I share all the examples so you can kind of go in there and look at it, you'll notice that there's certain things that I did here to style it collectively. And okay, so I did put the header, which is basically that image and a link inside of a header tag. And then I put the nav in the nav area. So if you want to take a look at the front end, but then I also collectively styled these two together. So I put them in another container with a div, right, that holds both of them. So the nav and the header are together. So we kind of talked about this last week a little bit here during the session. And why did I do that? Because I wanted to create this look here where the page contents were narrow, but the header went all the way across because I just thought it looked better. By putting them together in a container, I can style them together so I can make these two pieces do something different than the rest of the page. And then when I got down to the bottom, the footer is escaping that narrowed thing as well. And this is just a personal preference, right? I just think that looked better, right? Now, this is very simplistic still. There's not like a lot of fancy stuff happening here. The images are powerful. The design is actually super simple, but I think it's pretty effective, right? So, and this is like one of the really hard things to kind of teach is like, you know, what colors look good, what placement looks good, what typography looks good, right? Mm-hmm. And there are certain basic approaches that you guys are going to learn here that are going to help guide you to be able to do that, to not necessarily put a lot of effort into putting something together and still have it look really nice, right? And, you know, like I always use like Google as an example, like what's the aesthetic of Google? I don't know, whatever it is, it's a very simple one compared to a lot of websites, what they try to do. They don't over style, right? The importance is the material on the page.
Right.
Right. So I think that that one's kind of a nice example. You know, I have like, if you look here, and the reason I leave my old examples up here is sometimes I leave my old videos in the courses. So if you're following the older videos where I'm building like House of the Dragon, you know, this is what it's about, like the work that we did. I don't like this design as much, but you know, all of it is kind of happens as we're moving along, by the way. All right, so let me get back to that PowerPoint so we can start moving forward here. I did want to like just kind of review where my code was at currently, which is basically, if you recall, we had created, well, most of you should have created 2 pages. I created 3 just to do a kind of a demo. I had taken all 3 pages and I had put them into that structure, basically where we had the head with the meta tag and the title, the body that holds everything basically that's visible, and then the header, the nav, the main, and the footer all being inside that body tag. And that's the general structure. The secondary pages don't have as much content yet, but I did make sure that the header and the nav was consistent on both of those, right? And then as I add more pages, I'm going to keep making sure that's consistent, right? Because think about it, most websites, that stuff doesn't change. The header, the nav doesn't change, and the footer usually doesn't change. It's the stuff that's in the middle, like the meat of the sandwich, basically, that changes. So let's also go ahead and I'm going to open up my location on my file system here where this is stored. Now, I store mine on my Google Drive, and I have a special folder for all my Prometheus accounts and for this particular semester. And right now, you know, and this is probably bad on my part, but I'm still working in the Unit 2 folder, and that's kind of a mistake. I really should be working in a Unit 3 folder. So here's where I'm going to start. I'm going to actually close all this stuff here, and I'm going to do my file management, by the way, outside of the product. So I'm just going to minimize that. So right now, I'm not editing any of the pages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replicate this folder. I'm just going to copy it, paste it back into the same spot, and then I'm just going to rename it Unit 3. Okay, so there's a little bit of a strategy here, and this is one for me that was very hard learned early on. Because what I would do is I would sit there and I would code. I would just code on the version of the files that I had, And every time I would make a change, it was just on that same version. That's great as long as everything's working. But when the pages start to get really complex and you break something, and then the whole website breaks, and you're like, oh my God, I wish I would have kept the old version.
So that's actually a great idea. So pretty much you're copying those same files. So for example, say you get to unit 5 and you make a big error, you could go back to the unit 4 folder and kind of start from that starting point again where there was no mess ups.
Bingo.
Pretty much perfect.
So Juan, you're totally, I mean, you're totally tapping into it. That's exactly what it is. And what I learned from doing professional work, right? So like when I would sit there and work on a project, and let's say I would work in the morning and I'm like, I'm going to take a break for lunch, go walk the dog or come back. When I come back in the afternoon, I'd make another version, you know, and that way I could incrementally step backwards, you know, to the last point where it worked.
Yeah.
Right. And like, okay, we're backward engineer it, you know. It is a lesson hard learned though, and it's one that I'm demonstrating right now. I forgot to do that when I started chapter 3, and I should have. Right, but it's not too late because what I have so far I think works. So now I have a copy of it here. Now the trick is going to be here inside of Visual Studio Code. I want to open up a different folder now, right? Because I'm still opened up on Unit 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come up here to the File menu, and I'm going to go Open Folder. And now I'm going to dig in here, and I'm going to my project inside of Unit 3. I'm selecting this folder, and now it's opening up those files again, right? And you know what? I'm going to open all of them, right? I just want to have them all handy. I'm not sure which page I'm going to code on. I also have a test page in here for if I just want to try something. It's not part of the website. It's there, right? But let's go ahead and take a look at this in the browser. And I haven't showed you guys the fact that you can do browser previews from within Visual Studio Code yet. I don't think we're quite ready for that yet. But I am going to go here directly to my file window, make sure that I'm in looking at Unit 3 here. Am I in Unit 3? Yep, I'm in Unit 3. And I'm just going to open up the home page in the browser. All right, it's a little ugly. All right. But we're still working on basic HTML and a little bit of CSS. But I'm just going back through just to make sure, what do I have? What have I created? It was basically these 3 pages. These are dummies, right? They don't do anything yet. But contact works, about works, even though both of those are pretty blank, and home works. And I've, basically that's kind of the completion of that HTML basics. Now that we're adding the CSS in, once we get done with this chapter, whatever I've done here makes it, kind of like what would the project work would be for chapter 3 if I assigned it. But if you look in Unit 3, that's not an assignment here, right? So I'm not looking for that. I'm only looking for the case study. And I just released Unit 4, by the way. Unit 4 also is just the case study. When we get to Unit 5, right? So I'm giving you a little bit of a of a look ahead here. We start to do the case study, then we start to design our website. We get a little deeper into that, and then we actually start building it. If you've been following along, you're part of the way there. So I'm just kind of pointing that out, and I'm doing it in the video. I know for the people here in the session, you already heard this before we started the video. So I'm sorry that we had to repeat it all. All right, let's go back here now that we have ourselves grounded. We've got a new version of the files that we're working on. I remembered where I left off. Got everything all lined up. It's all opened up in Visual Studio Code. The stuff's loaded up in the browser. I'm ready to roll, right? So now I'm kind of in that mode. So sometimes it does take a little while to kind of get up and rolling. And that's always been kind of a thing for me, is making sure my environments are all set up the way I want them. Everything's up on the screens where I need them. So I'm ready to do my stuff, right? So here we go. Here's kind of a little bit of a repeat of information. But we are working towards ultimately working with external CSS files. That's our goal. But as we discussed prior to the video rolling here in class, when we talk about style sheets and we talk about cascading style sheets, that C and CSS is about specificity. That's a really hard word to say. And basically what the cascade refers to is the more specified the location of the style is, the more it takes precedence in the cascade. So in other words, if I add a style attribute right to a HTML tag like this will take precedence over the one at the top of the page and over the external. That's the highest precedence. It's also generally considered not good practice, by the way, but people still do it. Why do they do it? Sometimes they're locked in and they don't have access to the style sheet. They only have access to the HTML, but they still want to change something to make it prettier or better or look a certain way. That's the why. Often that's in a content management system like WordPress, for example. The technique for adding the style is still the same. So like once you're inside those double quotes, you're still using CSS syntax. Now I'm going to demonstrate this one. All right. So they're putting a style on the H1. I'm not sure I'm going to put it on the H1. Let's look at the page really quick before I go deciding what I'm going to color. But okay, maybe I'll put it on the H2. Maybe we'll make this a different color. So let's try that. So I'm going to come here. I'm going to add an inline style, this is called, because why do they call it inline? Because it's in line with the HTML. It's built right into the tag. All right, so let's just change the font color. So I'm just going to do color. I'm going to find something somewhat appealing here from the Visual Studio Code list. And you can see that, let's go with Firebrick. That sounds kind of interesting. And then I'm throwing a semicolon at the end. You will notice in that PowerPoint, the author is not doing that. I consider that really bad practice because if I decided to add another style, I might forget to do that and then the style wouldn't work. So all CSS statements, really, it's good practice, even up here, to basically include that semicolon at the end. All right, I'm going to do a save on this. We'll go back to the page. Let's just make sure it loads up. Here's the refresh, and there you go. Now, this is proof of the cascade right here, you guys, and this is why. I already had up here on the body that everything inside the body, right, that includes that H2, should be midnight blue. But because this is in line with the tag, it took precedence, and therefore that's the color that shows. All right, so that's an example of that. Let's move on to the next slide here. You can actually ramp that up. So like, for example, and they're going to kind of like start cranking on this a little bit here, is they're thinking of their H1 as the header for their page. So they're changing the font color and they're changing the background color. So wait a second. And if you're not thinking about this, so I can put a background color on my heading tag. It made sense on the page. I didn't think I could do it for a heading. Hey, let's try it. You know what? Not very hard to try. I'm just add it right here to the inline style. We'll just do exactly what they're doing. We'll just say background dash color, a colon, and then let's pick something that works with red. And I'm going to say, you know, something kind of light is probably good. So yeah, and that's what I want. All right. I think we did bisque. How about we go with a dark gray? I'm not sure if that'll work, but we're going to find out in a second. I'm not promising beauty here. I'm just promising functionality. But this is kind of interesting what just happened. Check that out. Right. It's not the most beautiful thing, but it's also not the most horrible. But it also shows you a little bit of something about the fact that the backgrounds can be applied really to any HTML object. And what this is showing you is how big that H2 actually is. So even though the words of the H2 stop here, that H2 goes all the way across the screen, all the way to the end. That's actually true for this H3 and for this H1 and for this paragraph. All of them occupy the whole width of the screen unless I tell the HTML and the CSS otherwise. Now, we haven't really dug into this concept yet, but an H1 tag is what we call a block level item, meaning it occupies the full width of whatever item it's inside of, right? And these are inline styles. The next thing they do is they take us up to the embedded styles. Now, once again, we've already played with this. We have these effects are already in place, right? So we already have a font color and we already have a background color for the page. And whether like or not you like those colors, that's a whole separate issue, right? Whether they're Detroit Lions hex code accurate, doesn't mean it's necessarily looking good on a web page, by the way, right? But it's a process. So if you haven't tried this technique yet, basically the approach is inside the head section of the document, and this is the part, this is what I call the non-visible part of the page. Instead of putting the styles in the tag, we create a style section up in the head, and then in between those style tags, we switch over to straight up CSS syntax. The way CSS syntax works, this is a refresher, by the way, is we start with a selector, right? And the selector is, what are we applying the style to? In this case, the body tag. So everything inside the body tag is going to have a font color of midnight blue and a background color of bisque, unless, of course, there's an inline style that sits higher in the cascade that overrides it. Like, kind of interesting. All right. So that's an example of that. But here's let's take it up another notch here. I styled the H2 in line, but what if I want to style the H1? I can come up here and add a declaration for H1. That's the selector. It's attaching directly to an HTML tag, a set of curly brackets, press enter, right? Split them apart, and then start putting in, well, let's change the font color on that. And I'm gonna, before I pick one, I'm gonna go here and look. Now the midnight blue is kind of okay for everything else, but maybe this needs to be, I don't know, something else. Let's think of a color, and I'm gonna backspace here just to invoke this color palette, and I'm just gonna scroll and pick something. I'm tempted to pick stuff based on the name as opposed to what it looks like, but I want to go for something very particular, and I might not see it. Now, just to kind of refresh your memory here, we'll do this kind of stuff all the time. Let's go for maroon. All right, that sounds kind of interesting. Put in my semicolon at the end, and let's also do a background color on the H1, right? And with that one, I want to be careful not to choose something that would look bad with maroon. So I wouldn't want to choose like a red background with a maroon font, right? Would you barely be able to see it. But since our page is already got a color on it, I'm going to choose this Alice blue. And by the way, if you don't like any of the colors that are coming up on that palette, remember, right? You can go to one of the color pickers out on the internet. The Google one's probably the easiest one. And if I want a very particular-ish color, like that's kind of a nice color there, I can do that, grab the hex code from here and drop that into my code if I don't like the colors that palette is pulling up. But you notice that Visual Studio Code also has a color picker built in. Like if I hover, I can come up here and I can choose like whatever the heck I want. Right. And you know what? Let's just do that. There it is with the hex code. All right. Saving. Back to the browser. And refreshing. Right. I am not claiming beauty here yet, right? I'm just demonstrating technique.
Keyword
I will
is
get to the point where I do try to make this look good. But for right now, I'm just showing you how this stuff works. And we'll do entire sessions, by the way, especially later in the course, where we'll spend a lot of time on aesthetics and being really particular. right? And I do think that's pretty important. All right, let's keep on moving on in the topics here. But they're kind of getting to the point where they're showing, okay, so like if I can put all my styles at the top, right? That's pretty cool, right? And I can still affect the whole page. And they're giving an example of like some of the stuff that they did here. They show you which hex codes they picked. And they obviously have like an H1 and this is an H2. And it does start to give it a little bit more definition. I still think it looks very primitive, but hey, you know, it's baby steps, one at a time. When they start to give examples, they often will throw all the pertinent styles up on the screen. So like, how did they achieve the effect that they just did up on this page here? Well, this is what they did. They tell you the background color, the font color, the background and color for H1 and H2. So if you want to like mimic what they did, there you go, right? I think I've done enough, so I'm not going to copy it, but you could try it if you wish. All right. I'm going to move on now. We're going to get to the text portion, but we've been going for about an hour already, so we're going to take a 5-minute break, you guys, and then we're going to come back and roll on this. All right, welcome back from break, everybody, and we're going to now pick up with kind of a little bit of a topic change here, because so far we've been looking at like coloring the words on the page and coloring backgrounds, and that it's pretty simplistic, but we're also learning about inline styles and embedded styles, and now we're kind of switching modes here, where we're going to start working with styling fonts, which is basically called typography. And this is a really important aspect of website building. I think it's often overlooked by a lot of designers, you know, in terms of like giving a little bit of attention to what fonts you put up on the screen, because it can say a lot. It can really help deliver a website really effectively if you do it well. Like which font you choose, what size it is, how it's placed on the page, the colors, the whole bit. There's a lot of concepts that go with this, and some of the concepts go pretty deep, frankly. And I don't expect you to internalize all this stuff immediately, but I am going to present it to you, and just always remember, if you forget, you can come back and look at this stuff and kind of use it as a point of reference. The main styles for fonts that we're going to be looking at are the ones that you see up on the screen. So there's the font weight, which is basically how bold or not bold something is, the style, and you know, the one they give as an example here is italic, right? And you might think to yourself, well, there's bold and italic, aren't those both styles? In a sense, right? The boldness really is a little bit different because it's actually scalable, whereas like making something italic is either it is or it isn't, right? And there's no kind of in between. There's also the size of the font, right? So sometimes when we're working, like just for example, like here we've been doing headings, right? And you can tell like the H1 and the H2, and this is actually an H3, and all of that is a little bit bigger than the regular text on the page. And by the way, there is kind of like what we consider regular sizing for fonts too. We'll talk about that in just a second. Then there's the font family, which is a way of saying which font are we using. That's what that one means, right? So normally when you think of like a word processor, they got a little box up at the top, and you just, you know, scroll down, find the font you like, and click it, and there it is, right? HTML is a little bit different. And the reason we call it a font family is because normally when we put fonts up on the screen, the problem that we have with HTML is we can't guarantee what fonts are available on the system that's receiving the page. Throw in the fact that some people are using PCs, other people are using Macs, other people are using phones. They might be Android, they might be iOS, you know, Apple, or they could be on a Linux system, or they could be on an iPad, or they could be on their, you know, Xbox looking at a web page, you know, and all of them use different fonts. And this is really kind of a weird concept. So when we have a font family, we actually select a grouping of fonts that are similar, hoping that one of them sticks, right? So it's not always very precise, and that's really kind of an interesting thought. We're going to start with the font size, though, as kind of a point of reference here, but I want you to notice this line here in the middle, medium, right? And font sizes, when we're working like in a word processor, and I'm just going to bring up Word here just for a second, but when we're working inside of Microsoft Word, we have our font sizes here, right? And the font sizes that you see in a word processor only have one correlation to a web page. These sizes here on this page are called points. So if I choose 12, I'm choosing a 12-point font. And what that basically means is how many characters we can fit into 1 inch on the screen, right? And really, and actually, here's kind of the secret sauce. Points are really designed for pages because this is an 8.5-inch page. Doesn't matter how far I'm zoomed in, it's still an 8.5-inch page. And how much text I can get into that 1-inch space. And then if you change your font size, it scales. But the point system, which is available in HTML, but highly not recommended to use, by the way, is determined for printing to a page. It's not for a screen. What we use on a screen actually is pixels. So the preferred format for declaring a very specific size for a font in HTML is to use the pixel system. So the actual default font size in most browsers is 16 pixels, which is comparable to 12 point on a printed document. So that's considered normal size. And then we also have this first column and the last column, which are basically both percentages. So these two actually correspond with each other, and they're just different expressions of the same thing. And I always have an issue with this one particular slide, and I'm not sure if I can't edit it, but it does have an error on it. And I always mean to let the author know, and I just never get ambitious enough to tell them, basically. But basically, this 5 shouldn't be there, right? That's my little correction on here. But if if you look at this really carefully, there are times where we just use percentages to declare fonts. So for example, if I declare a basic font size on my web page, or if I don't, right? So if I don't, it's 16 pixels is what it is. If I want to make something bigger, I can actually declare the size. So for example, I can say, oh, okay, make that one 18 pixels or 24 pixels or 30 pixels. That's fine. And it will always be that size. But sometimes that's not the smart move. Sometimes the better move is to say, well, I want this to be a little bit bigger. So let's make that 110% bigger. Notice that the M's, that's how you say it, is another way of doing percentages. They're just doing it with whole numbers instead of percentages. So 1.1 is equivalent to 110%, 1.5 is 150%, and 2M is 200%. But these are basically synonymous. 2M means 200%. Now, you guys remember when we did the footer and we used the small tag? Do you guys remember that? Mm-hmm. And I told you as I said it. Well, there's also extra small and extra small and large and extra extra large. And this is what they compare to. So if I say extra large, and you can use that, by the way, not recommended, but you can, that's equivalent to 200%. In CSS styling, what I'm going to prefer to see you guys use always are pixels and M's and percentages. These are not, by the way, really good ideas to use in CSS. Normally you would put that in HTML tags and I would avoid them. So my general recommendation is avoid these and avoid these. The only time that you'll really be using points on a web page is if you're creating a separate style sheet that's going to print out the web page to paper. That's when you use it. That's why it's available, by the way. So I wouldn't be using points on a web page per se, but if I'm intending that web page to be printed to a printer, like a catalog page from an e-commerce site or something like that, I would use points for the printed version of the document. Otherwise,
So
it's ems, percentages, and pixels. Yes, question?
yeah, is there anything larger than 2x, or is
Or than
2XL the
200%?
largest?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you can go way beyond it,
okay.
right? So if I want to make a font like 300 pixels, you can do it, right? And that's, and real frankly, Matthew, that's a really great question. You don't have to cap, it doesn't cap out at 200%.
Mhm.
I could make it like 3,000% if I wish. I don't know why I'd ever do that, but you could.
Is there an eventual cap at some point, or
you
is it
know
so far out there
well, the
that
eventual cap is the size of your screen.
right?
Like if I make the letter so big that it fills up my whole screen, that's kind of probably pretty ineffective, right? You think
Yeah,
about that,
I mean,
right? Yeah. Well, that's like if I went into Word and I just kept making that font bigger and bigger and bigger, eventually it fills the whole screen. I can't even see what the letter is. That's the
mhm.
cap. It's a common sense cap, basically. But okay, so I'll say this also: there are times where you'll take a word and make it just huge to make a point because it works in that capacity. Generally, I'm going to say it's probably not a good idea, because when you think about like even just look at this PowerPoint slide, right? Um, you know, it makes sense. This is the title of the slide. It makes sense for it to be bigger and bolder, right? This is kind of the normal text. And then this stuff at the bottom is a little bit smaller because it's really not that important, but the publisher wants it on the screen. So that's kind of the example. Now we're going to play with the font sizes a little bit, and let's go ahead and do that. I think that for the most part, what people will notice when you're looking at a website and you use kind of like default font sizes, like for example, I'm going to make sure first that all my drawings go, or all my little annotations go away. I'm going to make sure that my zoom level, and I'm using Google Chrome, and you go up to that little icon there, and I'm making sure that my zoom level is at 100%, right? I want to make sure that I'm already at that level. And then at this zoom level, right? And I'm going to make sure I'm also full screen. I'm on and this is a point of reference here. I'm on a screen that's 1080p, right? So it's 1,080 pixels tall and 1,920 pixels wide. If you guys don't know the size of your screen, I'm going to argue that you should. All right. So find a blank spot on your desktop, go to your right click, go to your display settings. This is for Windows, by the way. It's different on a Mac. But if I click on this display here and I want to see what the size of it is, you can come down here and it says display resolution 1920 by 1080. And this is important, right? Not everybody's got the same screen resolution. We like to think we do, but we don't. If you have like a giant monitor, I've got a big one sitting next to me here. It's a 27-inch. I'm not even sure what that one's set to. But a lot of the machines that we're getting now, or especially desktops, we have 4K screens that are like, several thousand pixels tall and I don't know, 4,000 some pixels wide, right? And how stuff looks on that screen is going to look a lot different. If you're set to full resolution like I am, and HD is pretty standard, the fonts on this screen, like, the tallest letter in a paragraph is going to be 16 pixels tall because that's what the normal size is. As I look at this on my screen, I go, that's really small. So here's a good example. I might go into my code then, and right in the body section here at the top, I'm going to say, you know what? I want 16's okay, but that's a little small for my eyes. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go font dash size colon, and I know 16 is default. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to set a new default, and maybe I'll go up to 18 pixels and see what that looks like. So here's a Control S to save, and I'm not ignoring the question, by the way, Josh. I'll come right back to you. And then I'm going to do a refresh and watch the page. right? A little bit bigger. I don't know if you noticed, did the H1 and the H2 change? Yeah, I don't think anybody noticed really, if they did or not. But certainly the paragraphs changed. And now on this screen, it's a little bit more readable. There's another thing that conflicts with this, and I just want to let you guys know about this. All of our operating systems, like when I start to look at the display settings, often they'll have adjustments for the font size in the system too. And if you really want to be accurate about what you're doing, and actually that's not the right setting, I apologize. I think it's text size in Windows. I'm set to 100%, and a lot of your systems, I'm just going to let you know this, you're probably set for a higher level, especially if you have a 4K screen. When you're doing design work, and this is a heads up, it's really wise to set this setting to 100%. Because otherwise what you think you're looking at is not what you're really looking at. All right, I'm going to pause here just for a moment.
Okay, so if you can just set the font bigger, why do you use a header? Like what's different?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, right? Because when you do use an H1, you can see it, right? It's significantly bigger than the regular paragraph, right? It's also bolder, and it also has more space around it than the other text. For whatever reason, with the heading tags, they decided to have some preset values of size because it's a tag that people use very commonly. Here's the thing though, you might look at that heading size and go, you know what, it's not big enough, or it's not small enough, or whatever, and you can override it. So I can go into the tag and actually override that. So like with the H1, if I want the font size, you got to spell it right though, to be, I don't know, I'm just going to pick a number, 30 pixels. And then I come back here and watch the refresh. That's actually smaller. So it must have been bigger than 30 pixels. So now I'm shooting for bigger, right? So I'm going to go 50 pixels, and saving it and then refreshing. And maybe that's more the effect I want, right? So some of it is playing. So H1, H2, H3, all the way through 6, all of those have a default size, right? If you don't want it to have a default size, you override it with your own code, right? So you're in control of the size ultimately, even if it tries to do something else, right? So the design control is on you. Go ahead, Juan.
And now, do you have to do that in the style, or can I do it like in the actual header section as well?
You could, but the general advice is, right, you really don't want to put your styles in line. I'm just demonstrating this as a technique, and ultimately we don't want to do our styles here either. We're going to move this to an external file eventually.
Yeah.
Right. And that way, okay, so this is a really good example, right? All of my pages have the same code, but so far I'm only styling the home page. When I go to the about page, it goes back to the old look. I don't have the colors, I don't have the sizes, right? But the home page has them all. When I move that stuff to an external file and link all those files to that file, I can change all of them at once. Right, and just keep that in your head. That's where we're moving to. But first, we're learning how the stuff works. So yeah, we can go in there and tweak the font sizes individually. Some things travel with their own size, the heading tags in particular, but most everything else in HTML does not. Right, you're in control of it, and ultimately, you want to be in control of it. You don't want it automatically sizing to whatever. All right. The last thing I'm going to say about this is once you have a base font size declared, and the place you really declare that, by the way, you guys, is in the body section typically. I do sometimes see people attach it to the HTML tag, but that's not really wise in my opinion. But any other font I put on the page, I can then scale it on a percentage, and that way I can change all the font sizes at once by changing the base font size. So if I decide to make this base font size 20 pixels, when I go back to the page and then I refresh, this is going to stay the same size because I told it what to be. But these two will scale relative to the rest of the page. Watch. Because you're learning the secret sauce now, that the sizing of the H1 and H2 and H3 tags are set as a percentage of the regular font size for the body. Right. So this is what I mean. This is kind of like deep and conceptual here. And if it doesn't all click in your brain right away, don't worry about it. You know, practice makes perfect. Now, another thing that we worry about when we're working with fonts is the kind of fonts we're working with. And this is kind of a little bit of a momentary schooling in the types of fonts that are out there, by the way. And I'm trying not to like stretch it and skew it, but this is PowerPoint. I forgot to hold on my control key. Anyhow, fonts fall into these 5 basic categories. And the top 2 are the ones that we tend to use the most in general font usage, by the way. There's 2 categories of them, serif fonts and sans serif. And okay, let's talk about what a serif is. If you look really closely at this like letter T here, in fact, maybe this is even better. Look, if we go like here and I make this ridiculously huge, a serif are the little decorations at the edges of fonts. So for example, the T's got a little thing that hangs down and it's got a little foot at the bottom, and the H has a little flag at the top, you know, and the C's got this little extra thing, and the F's got a little curly thing at the end. Those are all serifs, they're decorations, right? When we say sans serif, these fonts are not like that. They don't have decorations at the end. They're pretty much just straight lines or very angular and abrupt. And you know what? This is kind of a preference thing. Which one do you think looks better? Well, you know, I don't know. Which one do you think looks better? Depends on what you're doing, right? Some stuff will look better for one thing. Other stuff will look better for other things. The one thing I will tell you is that the default font that is used is basically Times New Roman. So if I don't declare a font, this is Times New Roman. The other thing I always tell, you know, my intro level people is nothing makes your page say, I'm a beginner at HTML, more than using Times New Roman as your font, you know, because that means you probably didn't know how to change it, is what it tells people. It's not that it's a bad font. This can look good for some stuff, I think, right? But it's really a preference thing. So the other categories of fonts, right? So we have monospace. So this is kind of a weird one too. Monospace is what we get when we're coding. So when I'm in like Visual Studio Code, this is a monospace font. Whether it's serif or sans serif, it's monospace. I'm going to bring Notepad++ up on the screen here too, right? You can see I was like typing up announcements for my class, but these are monospace fonts as well. And ultimately, coding tools always use monospace fonts inside of them. And the only reason typically you're going to use a monospace font on a web page is if you want to have a section of like, hey, here's the code. And you want it to look like code as opposed to look like decorative. The other thing that's kind of interesting about a monospace font, and where monospace fonts come from, by the way, is typewriters. When we used to use typewriters, all the little hammers that would be in a typewriter were all the same width, right? And then they put a little letter on there that would hammer the ribbon and touch the paper. But all those hammers were all the same size. So like when you look at a monospace font, the letter M takes up the same space as the letter I, right? In a proportional font, so if I take all this text here and I go over to Microsoft Word, if I still have it open, I sure do, and paste it in. And now, okay, well, it didn't copy. Let's try copy. All right. And I paste it into Word. There you go. And now it's switched over to a proportional font, is what we call it. Now the letter I, see how little space that takes up? And then if I find like a W or a M or something, let's see if I can even find one here. Oh my God, there we go. There's an M, right? That takes up the amount of space it needs as opposed to taking up the same space. So you see how the M is wider here than the I? So this is called a proportional font. The letters take up the space they need, not the same space. A monospace font takes up the same space. That letter I takes up the same space as that letter W or letter M.
Honestly, I think the monospace looks neater than the other one.
Yeah, that's because you're a coding geek or you're becoming one, right? And there's more than one monospace font, by the way, but that's a category of font. Then you also have cursive fonts. For example, Comic Sans, right? So that's your favorite, Matthew, right? But cursive fonts have a lot of different styles, and there's also this category called fantasy, and we have ones that are like super fancy. Like if you go out there to font libraries, and there's a bunch of them on the internet, I'm not delving into that right now, but there's ones that like look like the font from like a horror movie or from Star Wars or Coca-Cola or whatever. There's like gazillion fonts out there. Here's a tip though. Some fonts that are really, really cool are also not free. You know, some like really cool fonts, you have to pay for them, right? And this is a issue that professionals run into. So generally speaking, web designers tend to stick to a lot of the ones that you see on the screen here. I'm going to say with the exception of like these, you know, the script and the Jokerman and the curls and the MT or whatever. But Times Roman, Georgia, Times, Arial, Verdana, Geneva, those are very, very common on web pages. All right. So now remember before I was talking about font families, right? And that concept, and this is where it gets a little bit weird. So we're going to play with this right now. So I'm a big fan, real frankly. I do not like, for most modern web pages, to use serif fonts. It's just a thing with me, right? And you guys might feel very differently, and that's okay. You know, it's kind of like opinions. None of them are right. You know, what looks good to you might not look good to somebody else. If you're all about the Comic Sans, you know, hey, go for it. Right? That is completely your option. But when we do a declaration of which font we're using, we have this like challenge that happens, and I mentioned it before, which is we're working on different operating systems, we're working on different devices, we're working with different browsers, and on top of it all, you can't guarantee what fonts people have installed on their system. There's just so many of them out there. Modern computer systems, both the Mac OS and Windows, do come preloaded now with a huge font library. But there was a time, and I was one of these weird geeks, right, where it's like I had my own font library, and every time I get a new Windows machine, I'd import that whole font library because I was so frustrated with the 10 fonts that came with Windows. I was like, I can't do work with these. These are horrible, right? So here's the modern lay of the land, though. Whenever we're declaring a font, the practice is you never declare one. You declare the font that you want, the backup font, just in case the main font's not there, and then the category of font, just in case neither one of them is there. So we're going to try this. And in fact, I'm just going to, you know what? I'm going to just copy this whole style. I think this is a good one to copy. So I'm going to do a Control C. I'm going to take this back over here, and I'm going to drop in the style tag embedded at the top here. We're going to apply this to the paragraph, all the paragraphs on the page, this font family. So the primary font's going to be Arial. If that doesn't exist, it goes to Verdana. If that doesn't exist, it goes to sans serif, whatever the default is for the browser. Okay, I'm going to save this, back over to the page and do a refresh and check out the change. Okay, now I want you to notice there's a couple of issues here already because I didn't change the headings, right? I just changed the paragraphs. And here's the question for you guys. Do you like it? I'll be real frank. I don't like the mix. I don't like these looking like this and this looking like that. But the point is, we are able to change the font and you can experiment. And the kind of neat thing about working with Visual Studio Code, by the way, for example, if I wanted to change the font of the H2, right? So I'm just going to come in here and add an H2. And I'm going to say font dash family. Here's what Visual Studio Code does for you. And a lot of the higher end editors will do this as well. They have pre-configured ones that you can choose from and experiment with. So for example, this is one that's actually used a lot. And one of the other little tidbits I forgot to mention is the thinking is the first font's intended for PC, the second font's intended for Mac. So PCs never have Helvetica, by the way, because that's a paid font that's built into Apple. Apple pays for it. Windows doesn't. So that's really more the old-fashioned standard. Windows font, PC, or Windows font, Mac font, and generic, right? And there's a whole bunch of them here you can play with. So play with them. I mean, don't be afraid to try stuff. I'm going to go with this one. Notice that they have Sego UI, Tahoma, Geneva, Verdana, and Sans Serif, also telling you that you don't necessarily have to choose just 2 or 3. You can have a whole backup list. That's going to apply just to the H2. I'm saving it. Watch the change. The H2 is this. Refresh.
So,
yeah,
question going back to your code.
Mm-hmm.
When you put in the font family for H2, Geneva is a different color than the other ones.
Yeah.
Reason or just
I'm not really sure what the reason is. I'm guessing that maybe it's not available in this browser. That's a possibility.
Possibly.
Yeah. Like, think of this as a Microsoft product. Maybe that font's available in Edge and it's not available here. I'm not sure why it's color coding differently. That's a great question. Also notice real carefully here that there are fonts that have spaces in their names. And if there's spaces in the names, they're putting quotes around it. Good example of that is, right. So if I decide to change this, I'm just going to go back here. And I do Times New Roman. Notice how Times New Roman has spaces in it. Or Lucida Sans Unicode.
Trebuchet.
Yeah. And actually, this, by the way, is mono-spaced. Right? That's what that stands for. These are all monospace fonts. I don't know. There's some pretty cool ones here. All I can say is experiment. You might find stuff that you really, really like. I might go with this one instead. Once again, Geneva is highlighting that way. I'm not sure why. Let's take a look at it. And this is something you can play with, by the way, for hours. And this is one of those rabbit holes I go down. Like if I'm working on a website and I'm really trying to get a particular thing, I can spend like half a day just like trying out fonts and going, nope, yep, nope, yep, nope, nope, and then experimenting with sizes, with colors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This becomes a very particular thing. There's no real general rules as to like you have to use like one font for the whole website. You could use one font for one thing, different font for another thing. If they look good together, you're good, right? But sometimes, and I think right now I have this problem going on. Some of it is like Times Roman, some of it is like Tahoma or Verdana, some of it's Geneva, whatever. I don't think it's looking good right now, but the point of this is to experiment. So please experiment and try stuff. And then when you're working towards the final version of your website, oops, I didn't mean to do that. You hopefully will find the font that speaks to you, or speaks correctly for your website. When you start to like do typography though, good typography on a website can make a really big difference as to the readability of the website. And you know what? They're just kind of showing examples here. So like, here's an example that they came up with, and they're showing you how they're kind of slowly ramping up this design one step at a time. And if you want to achieve this effect, here's all the code that goes with it. They are doing a couple of things here that we haven't learned how to do yet, though, including line height, indents, text shadows. We will cover this stuff, right? Aligning the stuff in the center. Here's a relative percent. We haven't learned this stuff yet, but we are in process.
Yeah, I was gonna say that heading looked like it had a shadow. I was like, what?
Yeah, there's techniques for doing it. Just hang on tight. We will eventually get there. But right now we're going to play with these things kind of one step at a time. So we haven't played with like font weight or style yet. But we have played with the size and the family. So we'll hit all of these. It just takes a little bit of time to get there. So just, take your time, folks, is what I'm going to say. So let's play with some of these other ones. Here's some ones they're kind of strange or useful depending on how you're kind of looking at it. So let's take them one at a time. The first one I'm going to play with is line height. All right. And so line height is basically, when you look at a paragraph like this, you'll notice that there's a certain amount of space. Like you can like zoom in and kind of look, right? A certain amount of space that exists between each line of text. I don't know if you guys ever get in the habit of like picking up printed material and looking at it and look at how the typography is. And if you ever pick up a magazine that you think is particularly beautiful, like, wow, that magazine looks really cool. What, and then you start to study it. And this is the kind of stuff you should be doing, right? Is you study it and you go, like, oh, wow, look at it. Like those words really aren't that close together. They're actually kind of far apart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the line height of this, of the paragraph. So that's where my eye goes, that it needs it. So I'm going to go to the paragraph selector, and then I'm going to add another style here. I'm just going to do line dash height. I'm letting the auto select kind of put that in. And normally what we do here is there's a default size, which whatever it is 100%. And I'm going to just ramp it up a little bit. I want it a little farther apart. So I'm going to just I'm just going to shoot for a number here and go 150% of normal. Okay. So I'm going to save that, Control S, back over, and now watch the paragraph. So this is a paragraph. This is a paragraph, right? Those two. And I'm going to do a refresh, and notice how there's a little bit more space in between now. I don't know. Does that work? Maybe, right? But try it. There are times where I think that looks much, much better, especially if you have a lot of words on the page, that you give them a little breathing space. Or here's another tip. If you don't have a lot of words on the page and you want them to take up a little more space, line height's a good way to add it. Right, so there's an example. Then we have text align, right? And it says configures alignment of text within a block display element. And probably the best examples that we have here are probably these headers, right? So all of these right now are aligned to the left. That's the default for HTML, unless you say otherwise. And we're going to do that. So I'm going to tell the H1 and the H2 and the H3 to align to the center. And I'm going to teach you one technique that's maybe a little bit, in advance, because normally here's kind of what I'm kind of shortcutting, by the way. So if I wanted to text align this to the center, I would just throw in this style. Let me show you the effect really quick. Let's go back, take a look. Right now it's in the middle. Okay. As a title, I think that's pretty good to be in the middle. I mean, honestly, I think that's all right. But if I'm going to do the same thing to all the H tags, all the H1, H2, H3, I don't have to put it here. So this is a little bit of a shortcut technique, by the way. So since I want to apply it to 3 different tags, I want to apply it to H1, comma, H2, comma, and H3. And I want to text align center on all of those, not just the one, but all three of them. So all three of those tags, I don't have to like repeat myself and put it like add it to each one. I don't even have an H3, right? I just declare them all at once, set the style here, and then check it out. Right, all three of them are now centering. I'm not really liking the tagline thing a lot right now because I don't know what to put in there, but whatever. But you see the point, right? That I could text align it. All right, let's take it, maybe another step further. Some people will recognize that all that stuff's inside the header, and instead of saying H1, H2, H3, I could have just said header here, right? Saved it, and then watch the refresh, it doesn't change. So here's an explanation as to why it sometimes makes sense to group things together, right? You see the strategy of that? And I can also do a background all at once. I'm going to go back though, and I'm going to Control Z that. That's the undo, by the way, if you don't know that. I'm going to leave it like this as an example, right? That you can, if you have multiple tags receiving the exact same style, you can declare them all at the same time. Just put commas in between. All right, let's try to hit the next one. The next one's an indent. All right, now this is kind of good too, but I want you to notice here, it just affects the first line of the text. So like, if you guys were in school and learned, how to write a paragraph, right? Depending on the teacher you had, they might make you indent the first line of your paragraph. That's pretty normal. And that's what that one does. So maybe the paragraph is a good place to put it. And then you can declare how much you're indenting. You can declare it in pixels or percentages or whatever. I'm going to do a pixel based one. So I'm going to say 20 pixels. Right, there it is. So watch my paragraphs now on the page. So first line, those are going to indent. Here's the refresh. Do I like it? No, I don't like it at all, honestly. Right. So if I'm doing a web page, I'd probably get rid of that. But this is a demo, right? So just so you see how it works. So if you want that effect, you can do it. There it is. Pretty simple to do. The last one on this page is text decoration. And this modifies the appearance of text with an underline, overline, or line through. I'm not usually using these two. Those are pretty rare. But underline is kind of a good one. So for example, and a lot of us, by the way, okay, so let me just demonstrate this. Let's find a spot to throw in the style. So like maybe I want to underline the curse of Oak Island, right? But we haven't learned how to do that for a particular snippet of text yet. But this is a separate entity here. So let's find that. All right, so this paragraph here, and I'm going to do this one inline, and I'm just going to say underline. All right, saving it, refresh, and there it is, underlined. Okay, I can see some use for that. That could be helpful for sure. Here's one that is talked about later in the book. But you notice how like every spot where I have a link, it's underlined, right? And that's just normal HTML just does that by itself, right? I'm going to tell you what though, when I'm building a navigation bar, I don't want an underline underneath my links in the navigation bar. So let me show you a trick, you guys. All right, so in the style up here, now I can do this globally. A link is an anchor tag, right? I can set the text decoration for every link. Here's kind of a weird one, to none. So watch what that does. All the links on the page now, the underlines are gone. Now you can judge for yourself whether this is a smart thing or not. But when I build a menu bar, I might actually like that. And I'm going to just kind of ramp this up a little bit more just to show you some of the techniques getting combined here. So for my nav, I might actually just decide that really what I want the color to be is white, right? And I want my background color to be black. And you know what? Let's take a look at that really quick. Right, let's just refresh that. Well, I got the background, but you notice the links are still purple, right? That's because that's what links do. Links color differently. There's a built-in style in the browsers that overrides it. So if I want to force those to actually be white, I would do something like this. I would say for the nav, no comma here, space. For the nav links, I want the color, well, I don't want any underlines, and I want the color to be white. I'm going to save that and then refresh. All right. Don't like the font. Let's change the font too. Right. Maybe we'll go with this font family here. And you know what? Let's make the font size bigger. I don't know how big. I'm going to experiment. I did percentages before. This time I'm going to do M. So I'm going to go 1.75 M, which is equivalent to 175%, by the way. I'm going to save that and watch the refresh. Okay, a little excessive, right? Because now my nav is like bigger than my header. Okay, so that 1.75 isn't the magic sauce. Let's drop it down to like 1.3. All right, let's make that adjustment first. The other thing I'm like, if it's a nav, wouldn't it look better if it was centered? I think so. I mean, if my header's centered, let's center that one too. So I'm going to drop that one in there as well. Save it and refresh. And did I save it? And then I have to look at why it's not centering. Oh, okay. So right now it's centering each individual tag. If I put it here in the nav, it will center the whole thing. So here we go. There's still links. They still work. So I'm not sure if you guys are seeing kind of like where I'm leading us here, slowly but surely. Start tweaking this stuff. You start seeing possibilities and you start adding them in, right? And it becomes a process, real frankly, of like experimentation. There's a lot of stuff here that I would still tweak, but we're on our way. We're tinkering with all the controls and the buttons basically and seeing what they're doing. And then later on, we'll make it look just so. You guys all good? Any questions?
Yeah, good.
All right. I know we've been rolling for a while. We will be taking another break pretty soon. We have another page of styles to try here. So let's try some of these. All right. So we have this like text transform thing, and that one might be useful too. I think it might be particularly useful on like maybe the H1. So I'm going to just type in text transform, and then I'm going to let Visual Studio Code show you some of the choices here. The primary choices for this particular style is I can take words that aren't capitalized and capitalize them. Or if they're all capitals, I can turn them to lowercase. Or if they're all lowercase, I can turn them to all uppercase. Capitalize just makes the first letter of each word capital. Uppercase makes them all capitals. I'm going to just choose that one for right now, just for demo. So watch my H1 at the top. There it is, all caps. You know what? Let's pick a cooler font for that, don't you think? Should all nod and agree. All right. Let's choose this one here. Saving. Check it out. Whatever. I'm working on it. You know, just keep that in mind, right? Not the finished product. But you have to admit, it's kind of fun to play with this stuff as you start tinkering. Another one that we can try is letter spacing. And you know what? That H1 might benefit from that a little bit, because when I look at this, because I switched to the impact font, they're all kind of like smushy, right? I want to spread those apart a little bit. That's exactly what letter spacing does. So if you go in here and you add, oops, sorry about that. Totally jumped. I don't know why. All right, let's just do it here. All right. We'll do letter spacing. And this is one that usually you express in M's or percentages. So I'm just going to do like a very small value, like 1.1 M, which is 110%, right? Control S to save, back over here and refresh, and look at what that did. Oh my God. I thought it would just spread them a little bit, but you notice, I mean, it was like, that's extreme. And really what it's doing is it's taking the vertical size is what it's referencing to. So I don't want to do 110% of that. I want to do like maybe, I don't know, 70% of that, something like that might be a little bit better. So it's a little spread apart, not too much, maybe even smaller, right? And the refresh. And what's the right value? I don't know. I'm just going to keep playing with it until I get there. Now I'm down to 0.35. That's a little better. Yeah, I mean, actually, it's not too bad. Right. All right. So you can get like, this is like where, once again, like if you're like type A control freak kind of personality, like I am, right? Like you can spend like hours on this stuff, just playing with it. I just made a real subtle change, and I do like this better. Right. So don't hesitate to experiment. There's usually a way to get an effect if you just know the right tool to use. There's also what we call word spacing. So that adds space between words. I'm not sure where that would look good here. Maybe where would that look good? I don't know. The menu bar would look good, I suppose, but we're already adding spaces there. Maybe we can just do that on maybe on this weird thing. So let's try it down there. We'll do that one inline. Right, so we'll just add it here, and we'll say word spacing. And once again, use really small values here. So I'm going to say 0.4 M. I'm going to save that, by the way. And I know I'm moving pretty fast, but there you go. A little spread apart. Right, just to show you how it works. All right, next one I'm going to try is text shadow. And this is the one that they had in that one slide, right? That and this is a really cool effect. And this is kind of early to show it to you guys, I think, because understanding how shadows work are kind of interesting. I want to look at my page first before I decide where to put it. You know, I think the heading is a good spot. I might choose a different color for my font. I'm not really sure. In fact, let's start by making the font just a little bit bigger. So I'm going to take that up. Let's take it up to like 65 pixels, saving it, checking it. All right. And I'm doing that on purpose so I can see the shadows a little bit more. Now, when we use this next command, text shadow is kind of a weird one to learn, but the way that it operates is you put in 3 values and a color. All right, so I'm going to give you like a really basic setting, and then you can tweak it from here. I'm going to go 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 5 pixels, and then I'm going to do a shade of gray. So I'm going to do a pound sign. I'm going to pick a color, but I don't like that color. I just want to go gray. So I'm going to stay on the left edge of the color screen. And I think I'm going to go with, well, shadows are usually dark, right? So it's going to be a dark gray. right? And I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to save this and refresh, and then I'll show you guys what I just did. Here's the refresh.
That's sweet.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of sweet. It needs a little tweaking, but yeah, it really makes it pop out from the page, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
All right, let me explain to you what these values are in here. So this is what we call X offset, Y offset, and I think this is the blur, and then the color. I did think the color was a little dark, so I'm going to lighten that up just a little bit. And then I also thought the shadows were casting a little too far, so I'm going to drop it down to 3. And I think this is the value the author used.
Now I noticed you got 3px 3 times. You do that for each word?
No. What that actually is, and this is the part I'm trying to explain here because we haven't learned about screen mechanics yet. But on a screen, and here's my my primitive drawing here. So I'm going to draw on the screen. When we look at a screen, there's a coordinate system that's overlaying the screen that's invisible, but it's there, right? When we work across the screen, left to right, this is the X, right? X starts at 0 and grows as you move to the right, right? When we go down the screen, that's the Y. And that also starts at 0 and gets bigger as you go down the screen. So when I say X offset, that means in the X direction, this way, we're casting a shadow to the right. We're also casting a shadow down, right? So like if you were to zoom in on this really, really close, and I can't do it with my drawing tool, but if you zoom in on that really, really close, the X is casting, because I used the positive numbers, casting to the right. The Y is casting down, and then it blurs for 3 pixels. That's what those settings are. If I wanted, for example, the shadow to cast up and to the left, right? So watch what happens to do that. You can change those values here to negative numbers, -3 and -3. The first 2, I'm saving it. Here's the refresh. And now it's casting the other direction because I'm going up in the negative direction from where it would normally go. Isn't that weird? I mean, you can achieve that effect either way. Another thing that you could do, and I'm just letting you, this is stuff you have to play with, and once again, another rabbit hole is you can set the X and the Y offsets to 0 and increase your blur to, like, I don't know, 7 or something like that. I'm guessing. And then the shadow is evenly cast and you can barely see it. But it is creating that illusion of coming forward. If I make this much larger, let's say I make it 12 pixels and then make the shadow darker, you'll see it more often, or see it more clearly, I should say. So watch the refresh. Well, that's kind of a weird one. I don't know if you guys ever noticed this, but if you're either on the Mac OS or a PC, whenever you bring, like, for example, I'm bringing the chat window over, on the Mac and Windows operating systems, they cast shadows around all their windows to make it look like it's in front of the other windows. It's much more noticeable on a Mac than a PC. I'm not sure I like this setting. I'll be real frank. I don't think it looks very good. I think I'm going to go back to my 3-3-3 approach because I thought that looked pretty good, honestly. Right. So here's the 3-3-3-3-3. Yes, Juan, go ahead.
So I know you probably just explained it, but it probably just like went to my brain too fast. What's the purpose of putting three of the PX, like 3px 3 times? Why can't I just do it once?
Yeah, well, okay. So the answer for that is the first value deals with the X shadow, like which direction is the shadow going?
Okay.
A positive number here indicates you're casting a shadow to the right. If it's negative, it casts to the left. Perfect. The second one is the same thing, but it's the up and down one.
Down. God, it's kind of like the color scale then when you're messing with the colors almost and trying to get
pretty much, right? I mean, and like how you really see this effect is if you exaggerate the numbers, right? This one is called the blur. So it's like you don't want your shadow to have a hard edge. Because if you ever look at your shadow on the sidewalk, the edges of the shadow are soft. Yeah. This is how many pixels it takes for the shadow to soften. Perfect. Right. So you could set that to 0. And if I set that to 0, and I'll do it, right, and actually set the shadow to black and save it, watch the refresh on it. It's really crisp.
Yeah.
But you know what? That's kind of a look too.
It looks good.
But can you see how like man, you can just play with this stuff for hours.
If not days.
Yeah, if not days, right? And here's the thing, right? If you use a high-end tool and like if you use Dreamweaver, for example, they have a little panel on the side where you can just play with the settings. Oh, that looks cool. And then every once in a while, and I'm just kind of fair warning you guys, I get people who are like, hey, but what if my shadow is like hot pink? That kind of thing. And here's what I'm going to tell you about that, right? Is hot pink shadows look horrible.
Oh man,
it doesn't look like a shadow, but you can use it as an effect, right? So I could, maybe that's not the right color. I mean, you can do all sorts of really, really crazy stuff with this if you just let your imagination kind of go with it. And there are no right and wrong answers. I'm just saying there's just good taste and bad taste. I'm not saying this is good taste. I'm just saying that you can do it.
I don't hate that. I like it more than the pink.
Yeah. Well, yeah, right. And one of the reasons for that is the contrast, right? Because there's a little separation in the color and you can see that difference. And it probably would look a little bit better with the little blur on it.
I don't think maybe
not. Yeah, I don't like that. It's not an aesthetic choice I would intentionally make, by the way. But that's me, and I'm not you. And you always consider your audience of who's viewing your page, right? If I was, if I think this looks okay-ish. I'm not crazy about the font. I'm not crazy about the font color, but the shadow's okay. I might tweak it, and you know what? You guys should do the same. Tweak until you get what you want. Right now, we're experimenting. When you guys do the case study for this chapter, this being chapter 3, they'll tell you to use very specific values. If they're putting in a text shadow at all, they're probably not. When you do your own stuff, man, you're going to find a whole bunch of stuff. If I can put a shadow on my text, what else can I put a shadow on? That's what you should really ask, right? And this is where the rabbit hole of CSS starts. This is the tip of the iceberg, you guys. You can do so much crazy stuff with CSS. Remember those example websites we looked at? Yeah, you can go so far. It's nuts, but that's also what's so cool about it. All right, we're at another logical stopping point right now, so we're going to take another break. Let's do about 5 minutes again, and then we'll come back and resume. I'm going to pause the recording. All right, we're back from break again, and we're kind of going into the home stretch of this chapter here. And we're starting to talk now about a different topic, So just to review really quickly, we started by this chapter by looking at colors, how to apply them to fonts and backgrounds. Then we went into typography and talked about font families, font sizing, font styling techniques of various sorts. And by the way, this is just scratching the surface on this stuff, right? I hope you guys are feeling that. And now we're about to move into kind of a different category here, which is to talk about how selectors are applied to styles and the fact that there's different ways to do it than just choosing an HTML tag or sticking a style inside of an HTML tag. Selectors are basically, whenever we're looking at a style sheet, by the way, I mean, this thing that sits in front, like these are the styles, right? But this is the selector, you know, and the selectors so far that we've used have basically been the tags, right? Now we're about to change into a different mode that we can actually, okay, so that's what we've been doing is the first one, HTML selectors, but we can also attach selectors to classes and IDs. So we're going to learn about what that is. And then there's this other weird category that came with CSS3 when it was released called descendant selectors. And that's where it gets a little bit deeper. I think we're going to look at a really brief example of descendant selectors, but I actually think of that as a much more advanced skill. But when you get really refined at your CSS skills, it's a really clever way to apply styles, especially for complicated website structures. So we'll look at all of these, but we're going to focus first on classes and IDs because that's kind of a new concept for us here. So if I have objects on a web page and I give them an attribute, and there's two different kinds of attributes that identify objects inside of HTML. The first one that they're showing here is a class selector. And what a class selector is, and you can see it right down here at the bottom, is you add what we call this attribute to your tag. So you add a space, and then you say class equals, and you put quotes around it, and you give it a name, right? So for example, you know, here they're naming this thing new, and they're styling it red and italic, right? That's what it is. But notice how it's declared. Here we say class, we name it new, and then when we put it in our style sheet, we also say new, but we add in front of it a period, right? And that tells us that the selector is a class. And here's what's neat about a class is you can take a class and apply it to multiple objects on one page. So if I have, for example, a paragraph, a heading, a footer, and I want all of them to have the same style, I can give them the same class declaration, and I can style all of them with one piece of code or a couple pieces of code. So let's try this technique. All right, so this is doing a class, but first I have to identify some stuff on my page where it makes sense to style them collectively, right? So this is a little bit of a challenge, you know, because I have to, like, you know, have the content to do it with. So here's where I'm going to kind of apply this. I'm going to put it on my lists for right now. And I'm going to call this, you know what? I'm going to use their example. I'm going to call this class new. And the same with this ordered list, class equals new. Right? So I got two objects on the page, or two structures on the page that are part of the same class structure. Now I'm going to come up to the top and declare a new selector. So I'm going to say dot new, curly brackets, and we're just going to make it really, really simple. And we're going to say color, and let's just make it red. And you know what? Let's just follow their example. And I think they did text style, or was it, what was the one they did? They did font style. Okay, font style, sorry. Font style. And they went italic. All right, so there it is. So we're just mimicking their work exactly. So now when I come back to the browser to take a look at this, the part that we're changing are these two lists here, right? So watch what happens now. Refresh, and they're both red and they're both italics. Now, this is kind of cool too, right? Because here I have multiple objects on the page. They have different tags, but they have the same class, so I can apply the same style. If I wanted, for example, to also apply that same class declaration to the definition list, I could do that as well. So I could just come here and say class equals new. And now watch on the page how this will turn to the same thing. Now this is kind of a handy trick. So the class structure is something that you can apply to multiple objects on a page. So you can use it more than once on a page. And it doesn't have to be on the same kind of tags. It can be different tags. So that's pretty useful. Now, the next one that we're going to learn is the ID, which can only be applied to one object on the page at a time. So only one object can have a particular ID. The technique is basically the same, except in the attribute, we say ID. And then in the style sheet, we use a pound sign in front of it instead of a period. So I'm going to try to find a unique spot here to apply it. So I'm not messing up my other stuff, you know, because I only have so much stuff on the page. But you know what?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I have an ID on our div that we created back.
Yes, we do. All right. You know, and that's a good point. So I could, right, sample div. Yeah, we could put it there, but I got this block quote and I'm going to give it an ID of quote, right? That's the best thing I can think of right now. And then I'm going to go back up to the styles here and I'm going to address that with a pound sign, quote, curly brackets, and then let's give it a style. And I'm not sure what we should do with it. Let's just make it, I don't know, something different. How about, let's make it bigger, make font size, let's go 1.2 M, 120% of the original size. Let's make the color something weird, maybe like, I don't know, something purpley so we can see it. And here's one we didn't try before, which was font weight. And this is where you can make something bold. And I didn't demonstrate this one, so I apologize. But font, I can just say bold. I can say bolder. Or by the way, they have a whole scale for it. Normal font is 400. Bold is like 800, but you can tweak it up a little bit. Or is it like 400 and 700 maybe? So what, I'm just going to go with bold. And I'm going to save it. All right, let's take a look. Right. So this is going to happen. Where did I put that? Oh, right here on the block quote is where I put it. So the block quote here is this paragraph. So watch the refresh, right? 120% bigger, purple and bold and hideous to look at, right? That's a little rough on the eyes for me. All right. I'll go back to the code if you guys want to look at that. So the key to doing this is you got to add the ID, right? Then in your style section, you identify that ID here with a pound sign and the name of the ID, and then you drop your styles in. So this is applying a style to an ID. This is applying the style to a class. The difference between classes and IDs are predominantly this. A class can be applied to multiple objects on the same page. An ID can only be used once. So I can't name another object quote and then count that it's going to work correctly. Now we did have a pre-existing div, like Matt pointed out, and we called that one sample div, right? And let's look at it on the page here. Yeah, right here. This is the sample div, right? And you know what? Let's play with that a little bit. I mean, it's sitting there, so let's do something to it. So I'm gonna go pound sign, sample div, curly brackets, and let's do something really goofy like color. Let's just give it a color. I mean, that's probably adequate, right? I just want to invoke the color panel here, and we'll just go with that, whatever it is. All right, saving. Watch the div, right? It's going to change from whatever that font color is, midnight blue, to this other one. You can barely tell, but it did change. Right. Only one object on the page, though. All right, so that's an example of that one. All right, let's move on. Let's talk real briefly about the descendant selectors. We're not going to use a whole lot of this at this level, but as you move forward, you'll probably find yourself doing it more often. So here's an example, a descendant selector, and I'm going to tell you what, the syntax for this can get very complex. This is a very simplistic example, but basically what this is indicating here is that if I had an object that had the ID of content, like maybe a div, and then there's a paragraph inside that object, that paragraph would get this style. That's what that says. So in other words, this paragraph is a descendant of this ID. Now, we kind of already did this a little bit, and I kind of glossed over it as I did it, but when I was putting in nav A, meaning all the links inside the nav, that's a descendant selector, by the way. So the main object we're looking for is nav. We look inside there and find the links, and that's what gets this style and nothing else. And that way, I don't have to go into each link and give it a class, for example, because the descendant selector does the work for me as long as it's structured correctly. So in other words, that anchor tag is inside the nav. There might be one other spot where we can try this. And I'm thinking, okay, well, here's a good example. I have the footer, and inside that footer is a paragraph. So I can apply a style just to that paragraph as follows. So watch what I do here. Right. So this isn't an ID or a class. This is a regular HTML tag footer. And then there's a paragraph inside of it. And then I can put my style on there. And, you know, it's find like something hideous like deep pink. Right. That's pretty bright. And save it, because at least we'll see the change. Right. So the paragraph inside the footer here, which is here, is going to turn a hideous hot pink. Yes, that hurts, but it does work. So that's an example of a descendant selector. All right. There's this other really kind of weird thing we learned about divs, and divs are basically generic containers for content that is what we call block level. Like, you know how that H1 tag fills up the whole screen, the whole width of the screen, and whatever object it's within. A span tag is different. It's kind of a generic container, but it's for an inline element. So I can use that in the middle of a paragraph, for example. So here's a little, I don't know, let's try to like style just the word Nova Scotia, right? So I'm going to find that in my code. So I'm going to come back up here. And the one thing I forgot to do today is to turn on my word wrap. Because I was noticing I have some of these paragraphs are going off the side of the screen. But let's see, here's Nova Scotia right here. And I want to make that look different, right? So I'm going to wrap it with a span tag. Now it's going to close right next to it, which I always hate about this program, but that's how it does it. Then I'm going to cut it and move it to the end of Nova Scotia. Now I'm going to add, I don't know if I should go class or ID in this. I'm going to go class. It doesn't really matter. But let's go class equals, I don't know. I'm struggling here. Whatever. Right. That's my on the fly thought that I often, that's kind of my go-to if I can't think of something. And then I'm going to style that class, which is just going to affect this one snippet of text in the middle of another structure. So that's a class. So I'm going to go dot whatever, curly brackets. And what can we do to it? How about font family? And let's go, where's the Comic Sans? Where's the Comic Sans when you need it, right?
Cursive.
Is that a fantasy font? I think it's a fantasy
No, it's
font.
cursive.
It's cursive?
It's cursive.
All right.
I've been using it for most of mine, so.
Yeah, I kind of figured, Matt, you would. But I'm going to go, I'm not sure the right way to spell it, honestly. So in terms of the font
It doesn't
library,
show
I
up.
think this is, okay, sorry, like mistyping here. I think it's like this. We'll find out in a second. If it doesn't work, we know it doesn't work. And let's make it slightly larger. So I'll go 1.1 M. So 10% larger than it normally would be. And let's just take a look, see if it works. All right, here's the refresh, and there you go.
And how did you get what was the code for that? The span?
Yeah, let me go back to that, because it did also kind of split across lines here. So I just expanded my screen. So here's the code for that. So it's just span, open and close. Inside the opening tag, add a class declaration, name it whatever you want, right? Whatever makes sense really is what it should be. And then in the style sheet area of the head, I added this style. Different font, slightly different size. And this one is useful in situations like this, because I don't want to change the font of the whole paragraph. I just want to change these couple of words. And now I just thought of a better Nova Scotia TV show I should have built my website on. You guys know what I'm thinking of? I was thinking of Trailer Park Boys. Maybe I should have built a Trailer Park Boys website. You guys ever watch that one?
No.
No. By the way, highly recommended for comedy. It's like one of the funniest shows I've ever seen. It's all over Netflix, so check it out.
I have to watch it tonight.
Yeah, and you know what? Don't be drinking milk, because you're going to be spitting it out. You're going to be laughing so hard. Mark my words.
What's the name it one more time? I'll just Google it real quick, screenshot it.
I can't believe I'm like putting this out on the internet. Trailer Park Boys.
Trailer Park. You're good. Trailer
Yeah.
Park.
So there's just a bunch of goofy guys that live in a trailer park in Nova Scotia. So it's Canadian.
I can tell by
trash,
the
basically. But they are so funny. You will really dig it.
I'm gonna check it out.
Yeah, I think you'll like it. And then all the people watching this video are going like, what the hell are they talking about? Yeah, I found it so funny that we went back and rewatched it a couple of times because it's that good. And the one-liners in there, man, legendary. All right. Let's move on here. I'm trying to finish off this PowerPoint here so we can get done with what we're doing. Now I think what's kind of fascinating about the span element, right? So they're kind of like showing you what the purpose of it is. They're showing you how to use it. We already kind of did this, so I think we're good on this one. But here's where we're finally going to switch modes, you guys. So far we've been building our pages. Basically, we're just using one page here to do our HTML and all our styles. But you notice like what happens with styles? I went from a couple lines of styles to all of a sudden I got like 50 lines of styles. And here's kind of a tip, right? Really beautifully well-built, complicated websites. It's not unusual to see style sheets that are a few thousand lines long. I think like my record, like hand coding stuff, I think I reached 10,000 lines or a little over 10,000 lines on one website I was working on, because I had so many styles in play, to make it look, like amazing, basically is kind of the goal. But at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file in our project structure. And so like if you are in Visual Studio Code doing this, you can do it right from the sidebar here. And I'm just going to click the new file button and I'm going to name it. And you can call it whatever you want technically, but a good idea is to call it styles.css. Right. Notice a different file extension. And now what we're going to do here is we're going to ramp this up, and we're going to go back to our index file here, and I'm going to grab all the stuff that's in between the style tags, every little bit of it.
I was gonna say, can you show me that one more time? How did you do this? You just went to create the new
Okay,
style?
yeah. You know what? I'll repeat right here. You click new file.
Perfect. And just name it.
And just name it.
Perfect. All right, cool.
Right. Once you have that task, come back into your document here. I'll zoom out a little bit so you can kind of see that I'm grabbing all the styles here at once. You can see, I don't know how many lines that is. It's a lot of lines of code. And I'm just going to Control X or cut. I'm pulling it all out of there. And then I'm going to go over to my style sheet and I'm going to paste it in. However, I am not bringing, by the way, the style tags with. Those aren't coming with. Those are going to stay here. So in my style sheet, I now have all those styles that I just created all laid out. Okay, I'm going to save the style sheet. I'm doing Control S. I'm going to go back to my HTML file. Same thing, Control S, save it, save both of them. If I go back to the browser right now, okay, so here's the horrible thing I just did. Here's my refresh. We broke it again. We're back to all the old-fashioned ugly HTML. The only style that stuck was the one that was inline. And it's probably not a good idea to have it there, by the way. So now our task is I have to link my HTML document to that CSS file. I think they do a slide on it here, right? All right, so let's follow what they have in the slides. So external style sheets, it's still a text file, use a CSS extension, contains only style rules and no HTML tags. That's why I didn't want you copying the style tags into the document. The benefit of this, right, is that I can link all of my pages to that style sheet. So the look and feel I create for that main page will now be reflected on all the other pages as long as I link them. And then basically the linking is just this. So whatever you name it, right? So whatever you named it, that's what'll go here. But this is really, really simple. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the document here and type it in. That directive goes up here in the head section. So we do link. We say rel, by the way, and I'm not really sure what rel means. I think it means like the relation to the main document, and it is a style sheet. And by the way, this is actually optional. It's just considered good practice because there's some modalities where that becomes relevant. And then you put in the href like you do with like a link to a web page. And then you just close that. And then inside the quotes, of course, you call out the name of the file. As long as it's in the same folder, this will work. But you notice like Visual Studio Code like saw it automatically, right? When I was typing it. So you type link space rel equals style sheet space href, the name of your file, and close it. Right. Now I'm going to do this. Control S to save. Back over to the page, which went from looking like something to looking horrible again. And then all the styles are back. All right, here's the other trick here, right? These two pages still look really plain Jane, like no styles, right? About and contact. Check it out. If I go to those pages, if I take my style sheet link and copy them into about and contact, and I come up here and do a save all, and now I go back to the browser, about looks the same, contact looks the same. The styles that I've created are now propagating to all the pages. If I decide that I don't like the way the header looks, and I don't, by the way, and I'm going to be tweaking this as we go. I can collectively style it once on one page. All the pages will update. So let me see if I can just finish off this PowerPoint here, and just kind of make this grand point. Okay, so using the style sheet, we already did that. All right, so we're going to get to this little next piece here. In fact, let's do this piece, because this piece is also pretty killer effect, honestly. And then we'll make some tweaks and we'll call chapter 3 done. All right. Here's one thing that I don't know if you guys have picked up on yet, right? And maybe this is not stuff that you think about when you look at a website, but here I am on this thing that I've created, and you're going to learn some basic design principles here too. But basically, I'm on this page. It's looking better than that plain HTML, but I still clearly have a lot of work to do to really make it look like a web page. The one thing that I notice, and this is talked about real heavily in web design, is when I have a paragraph of text, man, this is going from one edge of the screen to the other. Have you ever looked at a really well-designed website? And I usually go to this one for like page content, and I want you guys to notice that this is a news site, and this news site, when they do articles and they put text on the screen, I want you to notice that when there's a sentence, it's not going from the left edge of the screen all the way to the other edge of the screen. And if you ever pick up a regular newspaper, and I don't care if it's like a vertical one or a big giant one, tall one, newspapers have figured this out centuries ago. Human eye, when they're reading a sentence, does not like to go all the way across, back over, all the way across, back over. By the time you get to the third or fourth line, if it's solid text, you're losing your place. There's a reason why websites take their content and narrow them up, because that's how our eyes like to see things, right? The other thing is, most of the time when we're looking at stuff, and this is the thing we're going to start doing more and more, we're looking at the stuff on our phone and it looks like this, right? Okay, when I made this narrow, now I can read that. That's pretty easy to read, right? But we're going to worry about the mobile stuff later. For right now, we're worried about this. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take all the content of my page, and I'm going to do this kind of like I did that one that I was showing you earlier. I'm going to take everything in the main section of the website, and I'm going to put it in one container and then narrow that stuff up. That's my goal here tonight. So back over to Visual Studio, and I'm going to do this on the index page here first. And right inside, and actually I'm going to check myself here, because I don't want to touch the header and the nav. You guys can do that if you wish. But really the part that I want to narrow up is kind of like the main section here, I think would be wise to do. And I think I might omit the footer from it. So often what the author is actually suggesting that you do, and I think this will happen in the case studies, is that you take basically everything inside the body tag, and you'll probably do something like this. You'll add a div, oops, I spell it right, and then probably give it an ID, and then probably call it container, right? Or some people call it a wrapper or whatever. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it chopped liver. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's just a name, right? But name it something that makes sense. So you can call it a wrapper if you want to put the whole page contents in there. That's not where I'm going to choose to do mine, okay? Where I'm going to choose to do mine is to wrap the main div, and I think I'm going to call it container in this case. And once again, it doesn't really matter what you call it as long as you're consistent. I'm going to take the closing div and I'm going to move it just below the main tag. Now, those of you that might have a little bit of experience, this go, why don't you just apply the style to the main tag and then you're done? And I'm like, yeah, that's the thing. You can do it like that. But I'm going to do it like this because what I'm doing is I'm creating basically layers of encapsulation, putting one object inside of another. And the more you do that, the more control you have over all the layers of the object. And that's kind of a thing you learn over time. The author doesn't maybe talk about it enough, in my opinion. But basically what I've created now is this div, right, that contains everything in the main section. And it's called a container, right? So this is just on the index page. Control S to save, because I just changed the structure of my main page. Now, if this works out, I'm going to copy this structure to the other pages too, right? But I'm going to try it here first. So back on the style sheet, I'm going to choose the spot to put that. And real frankly, I like to, when I style my pages and I start to style items on the page, I like my CSS to lay out so that, like, if the stuff's near the top, it's near the top of the CSS. And at the top of my CSS are my headers, right? So I'm leaving those there. The nav's also kind of near the top. So I'm actually going to cut these. I'm going to move them up here so they're kind of in order. You guys see like my strategy here, right? And then we go to the other parts of the page, like the main and whatever. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on that container, and I'm just going to say container, right? Was that a class or an ID? It was an ID. Okay, so I need a pound sign, not a period. Get my curly brackets in there. And I'm going to go back to the slide here, and I just want to show you what the author is going to do. The author is going to take the contents of the page and narrow it up so it only occupies 80% of the page, not the whole width, 80%, right? The nice thing about using a percentage for that is that regardless of my screen size, it will adjust to that value, whether it's big and wide, giant screen, or narrow screen. Could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. Another thing that they're doing, and this is kind of a weird little technique, is they're using, we haven't learned about margins yet, but if you set your left margin to be automatic and your right margin to be automatic, both of them, that in essence will center your page. So it's centering the content and dropping the width to 80%. I'm just going to copy this code because it's already written, right? And I might tweak the percentage, just letting you know that. So here it is, dropping in. Margin, left, right, auto. And once again, these will center the page, right? Then you have the width. So it's not going to occupy the whole page, just 80%. I'm actually going to drop that down to, I think, to maybe 75, right? Judgment call, by the way. Right. Just saved my style sheet. I'm going to go back to the main page, scroll up to the top. Here's my refresh. All right, can you kind of see where it's going now? And I don't know if you're feeling it yet, but this is already better because my eye doesn't have to go all the way across. Now I am gonna ramp this up a little bit, right? So here's me kind of like gonna be overachieving a little bit, all right? Because this is like beyond the PowerPoint basically, but they're demonstrating here how if you take even your whole page and you put it and you narrow it up, it does make it easier to read, especially on a wide screen. On a phone, maybe not quite as much, but on a regular desktop, very helpful. All right. I'm just going to finish off this PowerPoint. All right. And then we'll come back and talk about this. Okay. We talked about this a little bit earlier, the cascade. When you put styles directly on a tag, that's the highest precedence. I don't know why they draw it this way. It should be maybe flipped upside down. After that, it looks at the top of the page of your HTML page for styles, if any. Generally, and I'm going to say this over and over again, these are to be avoided. You really should use an external style sheet. Finally, if you don't have any of this stuff in place that's controlling the style of an object, the browser takes over and does whatever it normally does. Like if you don't declare a font, the browser uses Times Roman, sets it to 16 pixels in black. That's what it does. If you don't like that, you change it in your style sheet. External style sheet would be the first choice. Second choice would be at the top of the page. Third choice would be inline. All of them work, but external is the preferred. The other thing you should know also is that W3's got a validator for HTML. They also have one for CSS. It is very, very common to make typos in CSS files. Right. I don't know if you picked up on this stuff, folks, but all of the style stuff is all lowercase. Every item that we put in here, we put a colon in between, a semicolon at the end. Right? Curly brackets wrapped around it, selectors clearly defined. And normally we use this style of formatting, you know, where you put in your selector, curly bracket, next line, indent all your styles, then curly bracket back out at the margin. That's kind of the standard format. All right, now here's what I'm going to do. You know, I consider the chapter done, but at this point, I'm not happy with the way my page looks, but I feel like I'm getting on the right track. So I'm going to make a few tweaks to this to kind of show you some of the stuff that you can do. And I would encourage you to experiment like this. And let's start making it better. Let's start making it more real, right? Like so far, this is mostly like, hey, check this out. This is how it works. Okay, great. Doesn't mean that this is what should really be on my page. I'm going to start by, I think, maybe styling the center section a little bit. And I'm going to do a couple of techniques. I'm just telling you up front that aren't indicated in the book yet, right? We're going to learn these techniques, but they're simple enough to pick up that I think it makes sense to do it. The first one that I'm going to do is I have this container that I've set up that's going to hold my main section, and there's a nut. The container is like wrapped around it. That's kind of like a weird thing to do. Like, why would you do that? I'm about to show you why. All right. So first of all, I'm going to take this main section here, and I'm going to apply a background to it. Let's see what it looks like with a background. So I'm going to take main, and I'm not sure what a good color is. Maybe we go back to white or really close to white. So let's just do background color. And you know what? Let's just drop any old color in here, and then I'm going to use the color picker to actually adjust it. So maybe somewhere around there. And this is really super subtle. I don't know if you guys are picking up on it. It's not very pronounced in color, but subtlety sometimes works really, really well. I also want you to notice we're using a different color format definition. We'll talk about RGB a little bit later, right? But it is related to hex code. Saving, and let's go back here and refresh. Okay, so there's the container. That's the main tag style. Now, okay, let's talk about what's okay about it and what's not okay about it. The first thing that's definitely not okay is the words are touching the edge of the box. That's not good. I don't think that looks good. It's hard to read. And this is a mistake that a lot of young developers make, is they don't give things breathing room. And so one way that you can give stuff breathing room, by the way, is you can add this thing called padding, which is basically space inside the box. And I'm going to add an ample amount of it. I'm going to add 40 pixels of padding on the inside of that box. So every edge of that box that holds that content, we're pushing away from the edge and basically creating really kind of like a margin, but it's called padding when it's inside of an object. So watch the difference. Right? You have to admit that's a little better. Other thing, you know, if I make my screen smaller, right? Like some people might be on slightly smaller screens. That looks all right. When it gets really small, I'm not liking it, but we'll learn a technique later called media queries that'll help us fix that. But generally speaking, I'm kind of liking it, right? This is better. All right, let's leave that part alone. Now let's look at the header. I hate the way the header looks, right? The nav bar, kind of okay, but the header, not so much. You know what the nav bar could benefit from? In fact, let me just click back on it. Wouldn't that be nice if this was, they had a little more space at the top and bottom? You think padding would work on that too? Yeah, it sure would. Let's add some padding to the nav. So I'm going to find the nav. And I'm just going to add a little bit of padding. I'm not going to do a lot here though, because I don't think it needs a lot. I'm going to go 10 pixels. It'll add it to all 4 sides, but we'll notice it on the top and the bottom when I save. So check it out. A little better, right? All right. I mean, some of this stuff comes down to opinion when you know, right? Maybe you don't like it at all. I don't really know. All right. The other thing I'm looking at, H1, H2, H3. I'm still thinking of a tagline. And I think my tagline will be should have been the Trailer Park Boys. That's what I'm going to switch it to. And Juan, after you watch that, you're going to come back next week saying all sorts of stuff about it. I guarantee you. All right. All right, that will be a lot funnier. All right. The H2's got an inline style. You guys already know this is really generally not a good idea, so goodbye. Right, that's gone. Right. The other thing I'm going to do, and you know what? I'm going to let's see what that looks like first. Okay, let's refresh. All right, so we got rid of that background. I'm also going to get rid of the background at the top, right? So I'm going to re-engineer that. So I don't want it attached to the H1, and I'll show you where I'm kind of heading with this. So back to the style sheet, finding the H1, and I'm striking the background color. All right. Now we haven't learned about comments yet, but here's a little preview also. If you do a / and an asterisk, and then an asterisk and a /, that's a comment in CSS. So it deactivates the code, but it leaves it in place. And this is a tip, by the way. We'll talk about this extensively later. But when you're tweaking CSS and you're trying stuff, and sometimes you try stuff and it's like, I don't know if I like that. I'm going to take it away for a second, but then you don't want to have to retype it. This is a way to deactivate it so that you can see what it looks like without. But then if you want to bring it back, you can. All right, so there you go. So all that stuff's gone. All right, next thing I'm going to do is I know that all 3 of these H1, H2, H3, they're all inside the same container called the header, right? Now I'm going to style the header with a background. So let's find the header tag. Do I even have one in here? I don't. All right, so where should that go in my CSS? I'm going to say right below the body seems like a good spot. So I'm going to type header, curlies, and then here, I'm going to choose a different background color. And I'm trying to think of something that would look good with that weird red font that isn't the same like beige font or beige color that we have in the background. I'm going to choose a gray for right now. And then I'm just going to bring up, I'm just using it to bring up the color palette basically. And kind of gray is okay. Let's go with something kind of like that. Let's see how it looks, right? If it's horrible, we'll change it, right? But this is going to color the whole background of the whole top section all at once, right? Here's a refresh. Okay, it's okay-ish. But you see now, but the benefit of this, and I'm just telling you, is that now they're all in the same container, and I'm background coloring that whole container at once. You see the power of that? And you know what? That could use a little padding also. So I'm just going to add, let's do like 20 pixels of padding. Remember, padding puts space inside the container. All right. And you see how I'm making these little tweaks, and I'm hating the color of the font. So here I am changing it. I think it's too bright. So I'm gonna go a little bit darker. And I'm saving it. Here's the refresh. Okay, that's too dark. All right. Okay, so I mean, this is how persnickety it is, right? Like it can get super picky. And there's no right or wrong. It's all in the eye, right? If you know you're using Detroit Lions blue, you can do that, or Green Bay Packer gold. All right, so see a little tweak on that. All right, so I mean, we went from like the start of the day where it looked kind of horrible to it's starting to feel a little bit more like a website now.
It's
Right?
somewhat decently passable.
Yeah, I mean, all right, it's still rudimentary, and we got a lot of work left to do, but I'm going to call this done for chapter 3, right? I could start like throwing a lot more stuff on here to try to wow you guys. That's not my goal here. Is I just want to show you with the techniques that we have learned so far that we have accomplished a lot. The only other part that I think is a little rough is maybe the footer. I don't know if you guys agree with that or not. But you know what? We'll work on that next week, right? Maybe the one thing I could do is I could just center it, right? That's a pretty simple tweak. Let's do that, and then we'll call it done. So way, way, way at the bottom. Why? Because that's where the footer is, right? I'm going to just put in footer.
You already have one.
We'll just do text align center. And then we'll do a refresh and go look, and that's better for now, right? And I will make that look fancier too coming up. So folks, I'm going to end the recording here. So this is the end of the chapter 3 lecture demo, if whatever you want to call it.